Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Alumni Talk Core Context in the 2024 election. I am Tao Tan, Columbia College class of 2007 and Columbia Business School class of 2011, member of the board of the Columbia College Alumni Association and member of the Intellectual Programming Committee. I am very excited to kick off this Alumni Talk conversation. It has been described as the most election of our lifetime. The 2024 election will long be analyzed and debated by pundits and historians. In the first installment of our core context-themed alumni talk, Jen Maxfield Ostfeld, class of 99 for the college and journalism class of 2000, a reporter for NBC New York and an adjunct professor of journalism at Seton Hall, joins Larry Jackson, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Director of the Center for the Core Curriculum, for a conversation about the election. This discussion will consider what the 2024 election means for democracy, what it reveals about a polarized nation and about America's role in the world, and how texts and ideas from the core curriculum can help us make sense of it. Core Context brings together the expertise of Columbia College alumni with insights and ideas from the core curriculum. Inspired by the core's founders, who in 1919 launched a new model of education that would serve democracy by addressing, quote, the insistent problems of the present. The Core Context series will take on topics in politics and education, such as polarization, the dangers and promises of artificial intelligence, and the role of civil society in a democratic society. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Jen Maxfield Ostfeld, Columbia College class of 99, journalism class of 2000, is an Emmy Award-winning reporter and anchor who has been covering New York City and New Jersey for 22 years, currently for NBC News New York and previously for Eyewitness News. Jen is also an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University, where she teaches broadcast journalism. She previously taught at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, the same school where she got her master's degree in 2000. She received a BA in 1999, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa in political science from Columbia College. While on campus, Jen wrote for the Columbia Daily Spectator and met her husband, Scott Ostfeld, Columbia College 98, Law 02, and Business 02 in an art history class. Larry Jackson is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Director of the Whitten Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College, and a lecturer in philosophy. He teaches literature humanities, contemporary civilization, music humanities, and his own course in comparative literature, Justice Now. He leads the annual, what I've been told is the nerve-wracking process of making sure all of our core sections, about 200, are fully staffed. And he still finds time for thoughtful correspondence about the evolving role of the core curriculum and technology. I remember well an email trail a few years ago where we discussed the results of running the LitHum final exams through ChatGPT. It got a B-. Prior to Columbia, Larry held positions at the New School, New York University, and the City University of New York. His writings has appeared in peer-reviewed academic journals and popular publications, and he lectures internationally on education and philosophy. Originally from the Philadelphia area, Larry was the first in his family to attend college. He has a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, where he also received 2 master's degrees in philosophy and liberal studies. He received his bachelor's degree in American Studies from Skidmore College. Before we get started, please note if you'd like to participate in the Q&A during tonight's discussion, please enter your question, including your graduating year, into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Your entry will only be visible to the facilitator. If your question is selected, we will ask your question on your behalf. Please submit questions at any time through the presentation. For optimal viewing, please enter full screen mode. We are extremely fortunate to have these 2 distinguished experts with us tonight. I will now turn it over to Jen and Larry.
Thank you so much, Tao. Tao, thank you for being such a good friend of Columbia's Core, and thank you for that introduction. And I remember that exchange about Dante very well, and it actually yielded a great, very funny parody of Dante, which I've shared with many people in the years since then. So thank you so much, Tao. And Jen, thank you so much for being here. It is wonderful to be here with you. I can't think of anyone better to kick this series off with and to have this conversation.
Well, I was thinking the same thing about you, Larry. So thank you for that introduction, Tao. And Larry, it's great to be here with you. And hello to everyone who's watching online. Really appreciate you taking the time and the interest in speaking and listening with all of us tonight. And I think I speak for Larry and me and for Tao that we'd really love for this to be a conversation. So we've received some of the questions that you submitted ahead of time, and we hope that you'll submit more in real time. And in addition to Larry and I asking each other questions, we'd love to include some of yours in the conversation as well.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Jen. So you and I are going to ask each other some questions. We're not offering partisan commentary. This isn't a debate, but we're hoping that by bringing together your expertise as a reporter and so your perspectives on the core as well, and some of my perspectives on the core, that actually we can all together develop some new tools for thinking about this moment in our history and what is happening politically. So let's jump right in. I'm sure, like me, Jen, you've been reading a lot of analysis of the last election, but I'm curious, as a reporter who goes out and talks to a lot of people, what kinds of things were you hearing in the lead up to the election? What were some of the concerns that were being voiced? What were some of the opinions and ideas that seemed to be circulating in those conversations?
Yes, so just as a quick background for everyone who's listening, so you understand what I do for NBC in New York and what I did for Eyewitness News prior to that. I go out with a photographer in a live van, just the way you see on TV, and we cover the tri-state area. I typically cover the state of New Jersey, the northern half of which is part of the New York media market, and also New York City. So we go out, I estimate I've interviewed more than 10,000 people over the course of my career, putting together news stories on a daily basis since the year 2000 when I started in Binghamton, New York. So we do get an opportunity not just to talk to people on the phone or listen to experts. We are actually out there in people's neighborhoods, interviewing people on the sidewalk, in the supermarket parking lot, in the barber shop, in their place of business, in their homes, and hearing about what's important to them. So having covered quite a few elections since I started this job in 2000, I would say what resonated as far as what we were hearing from people and then was reflected in some of the national and the statewide polls in New York and New Jersey, certainly the economy being issue one, people really struggling with being able to fill up their car with gas, being able to, how are they going to pay so much more for the bacon and eggs that used to cost them one thing and now might be double that in the supermarket, and just people feeling like no matter what they did at work, that they simply couldn't keep up with the rising costs of things that they need to survive, frankly. And I went back and I looked at some of the polling just to see how it reflected what we noticed anecdotally. And certainly here in New Jersey, the economy was number one. I believe that was nationwide as well. And right behind that was immigration, which was a really big issue this election cycle. And you heard that in the national polling as well. But I think one of the pieces for us that was really interesting to see in the election results, now that we know what's happened and not just what people were prioritizing when they went in to cast their votes, is that Trump did so well in New York City. I mean, he got 30% of the vote in New York City. It was the best performance by a Republican candidate since 1988 and a significant increase even since his own race in 2016. And even looking at communities that were vastly majority Hispanic, you saw a lot of support for President Trump, in some cases a doubling of support, even from 4 years prior when he lost to Joe Biden. So just a lot of interesting issues and things that we've been hearing on the streets, talking with voters in New York and New Jersey. So I hope that gives a sense, of what people are interested in and what I'm hearing from them anecdotally. But of course, part of the purpose of this conversation here is not just to talk about what's happening here in 2025, but to really take a step back. So I did want to call out to Larry and kind of to talk about the core. Tao mentioned the core curriculum starting in 1919 in the wake of World War I. And I went back and I looked at the first syllabus and sort of what the mission of the Corps was 106 years ago. And Larry, I think this is so interesting because it really could be the mission of the Corps today. And so many of the issues they were talking about then still resonate today. So it says how to attain, this was the goal, the stated goal of the Corps curriculum and CC in particular, how to attain the advantages of group solidarity, yet escape racial, cultural, and class prejudices and conflicts, how to preserve national unity and strength, yet enjoy the benefits of international cooperation, and how to determine and devise an educational system that will be advantageous both from considerations of livelihood and culture. So I know that you're in the second semester now, Larry, but of course I want to call it back to Plato and Aristotle that we all remember from the beginning of CC in our second years at Columbia. And both Plato and Aristotle do offer these ancient lenses through which to analyze and think about contemporary political thought. So I wonder how, when you were reading these texts in the fall with your students, how did reading something like The Republic contribute to your students' understanding about modern politics?
Jen, I love that you went back and you looked at that syllabus, and that I quote from that statement all the time. And the line, "The insistent problems of the present," also comes from that original syllabus. And I think that is very much what we're doing today, still in the Corps. The nature of the Corps has evolved considerably since 1919. It was only one course in those days. Contemporary civilization actually began as a social science course. Students were not actually reading philosophical texts in the course in 1919 or in the 1920s. That came much later. But I think that by exploring these ideas and going back to some of these works from the past, it does give us great insight into the present. And I love that when we were talking earlier, you were the one who was bringing us back to that. And I think it really speaks very highly of you, and it speaks very highly of the lasting impact that the Corps leaves on those students who have gone through it. So one of the things that really distinguishes what we do in the Corps from the study of these texts in other contexts is we're not just trying to assess the validity of abstract arguments. We're not just placing ideas in historical context. We're trying to bring these texts into living dialogue with the present. Now, that doesn't mean that we're telling students what to think about political issues. It doesn't mean that our classes are just contentious debates about what's going on in politics today. But it means that we're helping students to recognize that these works and these ideas actually provide us with tools that can help us to understand this moment. So the Republic is great for this. We begin contemporary civilization with the Republic. And in many ways, I think the Republic could be the entire Corps condensed into a single text. The Republic opens, it's a scene of Socrates leaving the Piraeus, the port of Athens, going back to the main city, and he's stopped by a group of men who want to force him to remain in the port, in the Piraeus. And Socrates, rather than using force to make his way past them, tries to use persuasion. And that really became our jumping off point in class this year, thinking about the difference between force and persuasion, thinking about how life in a democratic society, a society in which we're committed to self-government, requires us to choose persuasion over force. And we spent a lot of time trying to unpack what that means for our responsibilities, what that demands of us. And we thought a lot about the different forms that force can take. Force is not only violence, but different ways of shutting people down or shutting people out. Those also can be types of force. The Republic from there goes on to explore a lot of different perspectives. The central debate in the Republic is all about the question of justice. And this is a way for students to understand that a term like justice is not a simple concept. It's a word that we might throw around a lot today. We might not think too much about what it means, and yet it has a long history. And many people have said many different things about what justice is. So that's another crucial part of the way in which reading Plato, studying the Republic, can help us think through this moment, to understand the complexity of the concepts, the terms, the ideas that are at the heart of many of our political debates. We think a lot about the relationship of knowledge and education to political power in the Republic. That's another major theme that comes out of the text. And also the importance of privacy. There's one of the strangest parts of the Republic is actually a description of an ideal city in which there are no families and there is no private space. Everything is public. Everything belongs to the public space. So we've talked a lot this year about the importance of actually having spaces that are removed from public life and from the political sphere. Similarly, Aristotle talks about the concept of political friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics and his Politics. And this is the idea that what really holds us together in a society is a bond of trust. And we spent a lot of time talking about how different that is from the way in which we seem to be practicing and understanding politics in our society today, where it seems to be a zero-sum game. The idea that we can disagree with one another, we can vote differently, we can think differently, and still be friends. That seems like a very challenging idea for us today. And Aristotle was giving us a way to explore that. The last thing I'll say about Aristotle is just that Aristotle's ethics talks a lot about what he calls virtue. And this just means skills or forms of excellence, practices that are necessary for community life. And that gives us a way to think a lot about what are the kinds of skills that are needed for a democratic society. Humility seems to me to be one of them. The ability to say, I might be wrong, an openness to the perspectives of others, actually caring for other people, that notion of political friendship again, and also being able to explain ourselves to others, to make our views intelligible to others, rather than just saying, this is what I think, and you can agree or disagree. Actually engaging you in dialogue and trying to explain that. So all of these themes come out of these two texts that we read at the very beginning of contemporary civilization. And those themes guide us throughout the year. And in many ways, I think they create a kind of model for what we're trying to do in the classroom, that we have students looking at the same text in every class session. They're all looking at the same words, and yet they're coming away with very different interpretations. The reason why we read literature and we read philosophy, the reason why we have them in the first place is that human beings disagree. But by reading them together and discussing them, we learn to disagree better. We get to practice disagreeing better with one another. So that's where I think these texts have been really helpful for us in trying to frame some of the themes this year. I'm interested in hearing, you touched on this a little bit already, but we tend to think of politics very much in kind of big picture terms. And we talk very much about kind of the national issues and the national things that are at stake in our elections. But there is an old adage that all politics is local. And so as you were having these conversations, you've touched on some of the national issues that you engaged. I'm curious then, from your perspective, what were some of the other kinds of local issues and concerns that you were hearing about from people?
Well, certainly the big local issue that we're covering right now locally in the New York, New Jersey area is congestion pricing, which has been a hot topic. President Trump had said that he was against it before the election, but it was enacted on January 5th before he was inaugurated. And Governor Hochul certainly a proponent of it with some changes from the original form. So, and I had mentioned a few of the other issues, the economy, immigration, that we did hear about from voters, but I thought that it might be an interesting time now to bring in one of the questions that we received ahead of time from Wayne Stoltenberg, Columbia College class of 1990. Thank you so much, Wayne. He asked whether the legacy media, of which I am a part of at NBC, are we generally looking forward to having actual access to the president? Unlike the last 4 years, we've seen that President Trump is more willing to come out and speak on the issues that I just mentioned and a host of other issues, whatever the news of the day might be. But one of the things, Larry, that you mentioned that had come out of the core was this concept of a society that Plato wrote about, a community where there were no private spaces, where everything was public. And it's interesting to think about that through the lens of social media, and how so many members of Gen Z and 20 to 35-year-olds really are living their lives in public, online, and even having some of their thoughts sort of curated by an algorithm over which they have very little control, and that so much of their data, things that they might consider private, actually are used as a way to feed them information in a particular way and a particular type of information. So one of the things that we are looking at NBC, and that every legacy media organization is looking at, of course, we're looking forward to having more access to this administration. But part of it, too, is how is the public consuming whatever information is coming out? And 50% of Gen Z adults now see social media as the number one source for news. It is the first place that they go to for news. And more than 60% of them are using some combination of YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram. And another big political story, of course, is TikTok. And Gen Z on average is spending an hour and a half a day on TikTok. So all of us in the legacy media have to grapple with that. Certainly, we've made some inroads into producing content and then showing it on social media, giving people ways to access our content through a social media feed instead of just watching us on television. But I do think this issue of media literacy that also came up from Darren Bolton, thank you for that question, Darren, CC’99, asking about media literacy and just people knowing what is reliable information and trusted information, and what is something that I really need to go and do my own research on. And in a content agnostic environment like we live in now, where people will read something, if the headline looks interesting, they'll click into it. They're not necessarily going to the news site first. They are being attracted by whatever the content of the story is or the headline. That does pose some issues with trust that we have to contend with. And I suspect that was something that even the ancient philosophers were looking at when they were thinking about who is your source for information and how do you know if it's trustworthy or not. So, Larry, I don't want to get too far back into the past, but maybe taking a look at two somewhat more modern core texts. Question for you to relate it back to these texts that all of us in the Columbia College community share. So I'm wondering if you think these next 4 years under President Trump and his administration will look more like the limited government described by John Locke, or do you anticipate a stronger, more centralized federal government like the one we all read about in Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan? And certainly all those executive orders, the dozens of them on the first day, make me think perhaps it's the latter, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about social media later on. I think there are real parallels between what you're describing in the world of journalism and the kinds of disruptions of social media. And in many ways, what we're thinking about when we talk about a core curriculum and, giving people, when I think of legacy media, I think of the ways in which we had a kind of common frame of reference as a culture. And there was a real trust for, great people like Walter Cronkite. And that isn't the case with social media. And social media allows you to kind of pick your own flavor and find exactly what it is you want to find out there. You're not necessarily engaging with difference and debate and a range of perspectives. So I hope we can come back to that point as well. I think you even more than Plato and Aristotle, I think that Locke and Hobbes are really crucial to thinking through this moment. One of the things that I'm talking about right now with my students in contemporary civilization is the idea that liberalism, the fate of liberalism, is really central to many of the political issues that are taking place right now in the United States and throughout the world. I'll note, for instance, that Viktor Orban in Hungary describes his politics as illiberal democracy. Now, in the United States, usually when we talk about liberalism, we usually mean center-left politics, the Democratic platform, the Democratic Party platform. I'm meaning it here in a philosophical sense. Liberalism is a very capacious, even contradictory, moral and political philosophy that tends to emphasize rights, the rule of law, equality before the law, pluralism, tolerance. And Locke is a major figure associated with this. He's often called the father of liberalism, even though the term liberalism actually wasn't coined until about 100 years after his death. Hobbes was certainly not a liberal, but he shares some of the same assumptions as the liberal philosophers did. For much of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the political disagreements in the United States were really about different interpretations of liberalism. They were very rights-based arguments. This is going to be a vast oversimplification because we don't have time to get into this, but Republicans essentially had a version of economic liberalism. It emphasized the free market, little regulation on the market, and Democrats had a version of liberalism called egalitarian liberalism. And this was the idea that in order to have the kind of political rights and equality before the law that are part of liberalism, that you also need to have more social equality and more economic equality. What we're seeing today, and there have long been critics of liberalism from the left and from the right. What I think we've been seeing in our politics over the last 10 years, and in many ways it's kind of confounding notions of left and right, has been that critiques of liberalism have been making their way more into the center of the major political parties. So J.D. Vance now talks about the new right as the post-liberal right. He draws very heavily on the work of someone named Patrick Deneen. I actually really recommend reading his work if any of you out there are interested in these questions. He wrote a book about 20 years ago called Democratic Faith, which I like very much. And more recently, he's written a book called Why Liberalism Failed. So getting some handle on liberal thought, starting with Hobbes, Locke, certainly Tocqueville and Mill, is really important, I think, for understanding what's happening in our world right now politically. Now, I'm going to disappoint you, Jen. I never make predictions, but I will say, the expectation of a Republican administration in the past would have always been that it would be very Lockean, which is to say that you would have essentially the standard norms of American government. Consent to the people, separation of powers, which really means limits, checks, and balances, the right to criticize government. And Locke also emphasized quite a bit property rights, and that went hand in hand with the kind of economic liberalism that was associated with the Republican Party for a long time. Critics of Trump right now are worrying that he is a Hobbesian or that he's going to move in that kind of direction. Hobbes had a very dark anthropology. He believed that humans in the state of nature lived in a state of war. And in order to end that, you needed a very powerful sovereign ruler, and that people had to surrender most of their rights to that ruler. They maintained only a couple of basic rights, such as the right to self-defense. The sovereign is not held in check by constitutions or laws. Disagreement or dissent is not tolerated. So, that is certainly the worry of critics of Trump, that that's the direction that his administration would go in. I will say we have the Constitution. The MAGA movement is certainly not a monolith. There are debates and disagreements taking place within that movement, and I think it is always good when a political party or a political movement has debates and disagreements and dissenters. That's a very good thing. I think Hobbes is relevant, though, for another reason, and this again gets us maybe into the social media territory a little bit. Hobbes gives us a lot of insight into the human condition and into the human soul, I think. There is always a temptation for power to overreach, no matter who's in office, no matter what party is in office across the political spectrum. And this is one of the assumptions of liberalism. I think one of the best statements of this comes from Federalist 51, one of Madison's Federalist Papers. And he said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And then he went on to say that if angels were to govern men, there would be no need for internal controls or external checks on government. So, I think that one of the things that we can learn from Hobbes is that we need checks on power, whether it's corporate power, whether it's political power, whether it's the power of the majority, what Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority. Every form of power needs a check. It needs a limitation, and that requires great vigilance on the part of citizens. The only other thing I'll say about Hobbes, and then I have a question I'd like to ask you, is just that Hobbes's insight into human nature also, I think, gives us a way of thinking a little bit about this current political moment as well. Hobbes thought that the state of war that he was worried about was always a possibility. And he cited as an example, chapter 13 of the Leviathan is where he talks about this, that even though we have police and we have laws, we still lock our doors at night because we know that we can't completely trust other people to abide by those laws. People still carry weapons, even though there are laws and there are police. Hobbes gives us some insight into the deep suspicions that we might have of one another and the distrust that we might have of our fellow citizens, especially in times of uncertainty and crisis, a lot like this moment. And so that's another area where I think we need to be vigilant. We have to, I'm not saying don't lock your door, but we have to be more open to one another and try to trust one another more. Go back to that Aristotelian notion of political friendship, I think. So um, let's talk a little bit about J.D. Vance. Let's go back to J.D. Vance, actually, because when we spoke before, we were talking a little bit about Vance. And one of the things you were quoting Vance, Timmy, that he talked about going through the Ivy League and really feeling like he had a minority position, a minority perspective as a conservative. And rather than, saying, "What was me?" He thought that actually prepared him for politics, and he thought that made him stronger in politics. And I'm wondering what as somebody who's observing all of this as a reporter and just in your own thinking. I mean, do you think it's getting harder for people to disagree with one another?
Well, to the last question you asked, yes, I do think in general it's certainly getting harder for people to disagree in a civil fashion. I'd like to know how many other people on the call still have their CC books. I'm looking up chapter 13 that you just quoted here, Larry. So thank you. I appreciate that. Still annotated.
Wonderful, wonderful. I
So-
hope I got the chapter. In my memory, it's 13. So I hope I got that right. And I always tell my students, if you remember nothing else from contemporary civilization, it is that Hobbes described the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And I make them actually chant that together sometimes in class. So yes, go back to that chapter. It's rich. It is
a little,
a very
little
rich
light
text.
reading for later
Yes,
on
yes,
tonight. But yes,
exactly.
I suspect I'm not the only Columbia College alum on this call who still has the library of all of the books that we read together
Yep.
so many decades ago. Okay, so J.D. Vance, a really interesting person to have come on the political scene. And I heard an interview with him a couple months back when he was still a candidate for vice president. And he was speaking about his experience at Yale Law School. So he went to the Marines, then went to Ohio State to get his undergraduate degree, and then went to Yale Law School and talked about, look, he was an outsider from pretty much any metric, whether it was from his humble beginnings in Middletown, Ohio, or the fact he'd served in the military. And then here he comes, or the fact that he had a more conservative outlook on the world. And so here he comes to Yale Law School. And then he, as he describes it, he spent 3 years refining his positions and debating his positions because, as you pointed out, Larry, he was in the political minority on campus. And you've heard similar things from Vivek Ramaswamy and some other of the younger people who we heard from this election cycle on the Republican side. And you've heard a real desire in many of their cases to debate their ideas, a willingness to go onto podcasts. And that's not to say that the Democrats have not been willing to do those things. But the point that J.D. Vance is making is that these Republicans who are coming out of more left-leaning institutions like Yale Law School have been prepared and trained in a way because they've already been explaining their ideas and debating with their peers. So it's not as much of a hard turn for them to go on the debate stage or to go on to a TV news set or to go onto a podcast with someone who may not share all of their views, but they're able to and quite comfortable with, especially in the case of J.D. Vance, being able to explain these ideas. And so one of the things that I wonder about at Columbia and just about higher education in general, you've talked about, and I know one of the core missions of the core curriculum and CC in particular is to push back against polarization. And as you said, teach people to disagree in a constructive and civil way. And so I wonder if you worry about there not being enough diversity of thought at Columbia, whether it's in the classroom, among the students, or among the faculty, and whether in some ways this is doing a disservice to all students to not have more of an opportunity to have to defend their ideas and to have to be challenged and to be able to have those tough conversations that I, as an alum, certainly think that the CC class is an ideal space to really flex those muscles and learn to do that.
This gets to the very heart of three terms really, that get thrown around a lot in academia, and people rarely take the time to actually think about what they mean. And one is the humanities, another is liberal arts or liberal education. And, those are two terms that actually come to us from Cicero more than 2,000 years ago. And what Cicero meant by these terms was actually being able to get outside of ourselves, actually being able to transcend our own interests. What makes liberal arts education liberal is the idea that it frees us from simply thinking in terms of our own perspective, our own interests. And that's what's really meant by the humanities and by the liberal arts. It requires you to explore a broad range of perspectives. The third term that I'll put out there is critical thinking, and I think that critical thinking requires this as well. And the hope is that when students get together and they're reading these texts, some people think that the core is what Matthew Arnold once said, the best that has ever been thought and said. Yes, in some cases it is. In some cases, it's the worst that's ever been thought and said. And in many cases, it's somewhere in between. These are encounters with people who have thought about a range of ideas and have presented their perspectives and opinions in various ways. And sometimes you can find, within a single text, really admirable sentiments, really terrible ideas, and sometimes in the space of the one page. And the theory, the hope, and I dare say that I see it happen in practice, is that through these encounters, people will change their minds, they will deepen their convictions, and they will be able to actually form opinions for themselves. I would venture to say that it is impossible to think, that it is impossible to have an opinion without friction, without difference, without being able to explore as wide a range of the opinions and ideas available on that topic. And this is one of the reasons also why I think so highly of your profession. I think this is what journalism is doing as well. It is really elevating a whole range of perspectives and experiences. And that's why it's so crucial also to democratic life. When we read in the core, we're not endorsing any one view. There's not, a kind of teleological conception of the syllabus. It's not that the last thing we read is the best, and the second to last thing is the second best, and the first thing we read is the worst. It's just the opposite. I mean, it's not just the opposite. These texts are actually always in dialogue with one another. And sometimes you say, yeah, Aristotle got a few things right, and he was much better on this issue than this more contemporary thinker. And sometimes the contemporary thinker gets other things right and bests the ancient thinkers. Um, I do think that our students are aware of a wide range of views today. I think it's impossible not to be. My own sense is that that our politics today, the so-called Overton window, what was considered the range of kind of common accepted opinions, political opinions in a society, has broadened in recent years, in the last decade or so. Terms like populism and socialism were terms that you encountered in history books when I was in college. They're now being talked about and debated in our main political parties. So I think the students, they're acquainted with these ideas. What I've observed is that a couple of years ago, I was really struck by how polished students sometimes seem to be when they presented their political arguments. And then I noticed that the political argument I heard from, one student was a lot like the political argument I was hearing from another student. And then I started to talk to people who weren't my students, just other people out in the world. And I was hearing very similar things, and it was very polished. And I think that one of the things that social media has enabled people to do is to very quickly absorb talking points on issues and to kind of find a sort of ready-made, off-the-shelf opinion that they can bring out in conversation. And I think it was harder to do that before social media. If you're on Instagram, you know that people post those slides. Slide one has 3 bullet points, and then you swipe, and slide two has 3 bullet points, and so forth. And people are really assimilating that, and they're really bringing that into conversation. What I want people to do, not just our students, I want everybody to do. Everybody who's watching tonight, I want you to do this. I try to do this. Is be a little more bespoke in your thinking. Try to start from where you stand and what you really think, and try not to rely on the off the shelf arguments and opinions that you get. And that's what I think a class like contemporary civilization can help students to do, because you can't pack Aristotle into a few bullet points. And the distance that we cover historically means that there's a way of getting into contemporary political ideas, as we've discussed, in a very strange and different context. And that makes students really step back and have to think for themselves, I think. And what we need to do is just to sustain that. We need to create spaces so that students can continue to do that once they leave the classroom as well. So on this note, as someone who has these texts still, and it's one of the things I love, and Tao has mentioned this as well. In fact, I think Tao said that he and his wife actually knew that they were getting serious when they combined their core libraries. I'm curious, whether any of these ideas and any of these texts come into your work as a reporter also. I mean, do I will mention, every text that I've referred to tonight, you were the one who brought them into the conversation. So you're clearly thinking back to them. They've clearly made a lasting impact on you. Does that happen when you're doing your work, when you're reporting? Are you thinking back on some of these works? And are those ideas kind of shaping how you're asking people questions or how you're interpreting what they're telling you?
I think, and perhaps I speak for other alums on the call tonight as well, but it feels like a lot of it is sort of in the subconscious, where it informs the questions I ask and the way I approach a story and the broad view I try to take. I mean, I'll mention a couple things that I do think come up from time to time. You mentioned the concept of justice before, and that's something you cover early in CC. And I think about Socrates' 2 columns, right? One is justice and one is injustice. So stealing something is obviously unjust. But what if you're stealing your enemy's ammunition so they don't kill you with it? Okay, well, then that's just. So just this idea of sort of contextualizing things, I think it's just an interesting way of looking at the world. Something I've been thinking about recently is Machiavelli, actually, who talks about how fragile a republic is and how people who are part of it have to remember how fragile and special it is. And it really requires vigilance on both the part of the citizens and their leaders. That feels very contemporary and something that certainly we know that people are consuming a lot of information now. We know that people are engaged. I don't think that that's really the issue. I think the issue is the quality of the information they're receiving. And so I think that the desire to be vigilant is there. I think it's on me and other members of the media and other academics like Larry to really try to educate people that they're getting that healthy information and that they're getting more information than just what already bolsters what they already are thinking about. So those are a couple things I've been thinking of lately. I do think it's interesting that Stoicism is sort of having a moment. And if anyone has ever read anything by Ryan Holiday, it's sort of a pop psychology, a very light read of some of the ancient Stoics, but not basically not catastrophizing things, not always going to the nightmare political scenario. And sometimes when you need a calmer moment, some of those ancient Stoics can be very helpful when you're concerned about what might happen tomorrow or next week or next year in our political world. So I think, Larry, what you're doing in the contemporary civilization classroom and what all of your contemporaries are doing, I think it's so important, and I really think it's a microcosm of what I wish were happening more on a national level, not just on a debate stage, but among people sitting at their local restaurant or in their school board meeting or around the water cooler at work. I wish more of these conversations were happening. So we're going to try to take a few questions, but before we do that, I just wonder, the last question I have for you is I'm always trying to get people to open up to me in interviews and say what they think and try to not self-censor, right? And I wonder how you do that in your class and whether you think there might be some wisdom in there for the broader public to communicate more effectively and also with more compassion.
Yeah, Jen, I love that. I love that you talked about the core being this kind of unconscious presence that's with you. And I think that's exactly right. And I think, what we do, what all of you who have been through the core have is this kind of roadmap of ideas that you can go back to and you can explore again and again and again. And it will always be new. It will always change because you're always changing. And because the texts are rich and there are always new interpretations that you can draw from them. And I love your mention of school boards and water coolers. And you're describing exactly what John Dewey had in mind. In 1938, he gave a talk, very brief talk, which you can find online. And if anyone is interested in any of these ideas, I strongly recommend this talk by Dewey. It's very brief. It's called Creative Democracy, the Task Before Us. And Dewey argued that democracy was not just about voting, it was not just about laws, that democracy was a way of life. And when you read through that speech that he gave, two of the words that appear again and again are faith and hope. And it's the faith that we have in one another. It's the hope that we might be able to persuade one another or peacefully coexist, even if we disagree with one another. And so, I think probably one of the, as someone who knows you, as someone who's talked with you, I mean, one of the ways in which you're able to get people to open up is that people trust you and that in your face-to-face conversations with them, there is a sense of accountability. There is a sense of being there with another person, giving them your attention. We need more of that. And I think that is one of the advantages that we have in the core classroom. One of the questions I've gotten a lot of over the last year or so is, if the core is so great, why have we seen the kinds of divisions that we have been witnessing over the last year? And, the answer to that is that the core classroom is a small space of 20 people who know one another, who are there face to face talking to one another. It's really hard to villainize someone when they're sitting right there talking with you, sharing their experience, and you're opening up to them also. It's a space of trust in which people are there together. And one of the things that we've really been losing in our culture, Dewey was already talking about it 100 years ago in his book, The Public and Its Problems. Robert Putnam has documented it in his amazing book, Bowling Alone. But more and more disengagement from the school boards and the bowling leagues and the civic clubs like the Shriners or the Lions and all of the ways in which people used to go out and engage with their neighbors. And it was talking about things like traffic lights and speed limits and water quality and air quality, really local issues that affected them face to face, being able to share their opinions and their disagreements with their neighbors. When we lose that, we lose the foundation of democracy. We lose that political friendship and that trust that you need in order to have differences of opinion and debates, and in order to be able to coexist with people that you disagree with. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. To anybody who is out there, I mean, if at any moment you feel that getting involved in the local school board or the local town council or being on the library committee is futile and pointless, it's not. It is the crucial work of democratic life.
I couldn't agree more. And it reminds me of some troubling aspects that we are looking at in the media world that relate to what you're talking about, Larry, which have to do with what we call media deserts. And these are parts of the United States where there is no local newspaper anymore.
Yes.
And there are more than 300 counties in the country right now that are not having a journalist in their school board meeting or their town council, where these things in some ways are happening in a vacuum. And yes, we may have these wonderful devices that we can get all kinds of information on in our pockets all the time, but we are not financing, we are not supporting from a business perspective the journalists to go out and actually get those stories about water quality and environmental issues and educational issues. And there's a lot of clickbait out there for people to be interested in. But some of these more substantive topics that you just brought up are missing from hundreds of counties in the United States. And it makes for a less informed populace, and it also makes, by definition, for a less informed voter base.
Absolutely.
And these things have huge consequences. And it's something that the media business, and frankly, more than that, the country really has to deal with, whether we want to continue to watch these local newspapers and local radio stations shut down, and with them, so much crucial information to the community going out.
Jen, what I actually just said about local democracy and municipal meetings and other things came out of my experience. I grew up, mostly out in an area right outside of Philadelphia called the Upper Perkiomen Valley. It's a string of 4 tiny towns that you can drive through and you blink and you've missed everything. And one of my first jobs when I was still in high school was as a stringer for the local newspaper called Town and Country. And my beat was all the local municipal meetings. And it was inspiring. It was, I mean, the meetings could be dull and they went on for hours, but you were seeing ordinary people come in and say, my street isn't safe. I feel like my kids aren't safe because the speed limit is too high or there's not a stop sign. And they've talked to their neighbors, they've put together a petition, they come in and they speak, and it's inspiring. And I can remember some of those moments. And being on the newspaper was really a big part of how I learned what democracy really looks like. So you're right. I mean, the local newspapers, local media are so crucial.
Yes, and it's democracy in action. That's what you're looking at there. You said earlier that you wanted to go back to social media, and as I said, Darren Bolton asked a question about, is there any hope for a shared reality, given the poor media literacy and overall lack of trust in legacy media? And I think that concept of a shared reality or a shared truth is one that's very hard to grapple with these days when you're talking to people you disagree with, because person A has one set of facts and person B has another set of facts. And oftentimes they operate in 2 completely independent silos with their separate sets of facts, and everybody thinks that they're right. And it's hard to find that common ground.
Yeah, Absolutely. Hannah Arendt, in her 1962 book, I think it's 62, Between Past and Future, has an essay called Truth in Politics. And she argues that facts are crucial to politics, that you need to have a kind of stable, agreed upon world. And then from there, you can have different interpretations of the facts. And I've noticed we've gotten a bunch of questions that are actually touching on this. David Aaron, Jeffrey Zucker, a few others have asked about this, that how can we have politics in this country when we can't agree on the facts? I'll just say very quickly that there's an experiment I did with my students back in the fall semester where I said, how many of you think that climate change is caused by humans? And everybody's hand went up. And I said, how many of you have actually read the science? Not a single hand went up. And that's not to say that they're wrong or anything else, but it's to say that very often what we think of and what we talk about when we talk about facts actually rest on a layer of trust. And it might be trust in the media, it might be trust in academic institutions, trust in the government. And so I think that's contributing a lot to this kind of siloing of people having very different realities right now. That there isn't that shared sense of trust in these institutions. And I think if we can build that back up, and some of building that back up also means listening to people. It means, not just writing off the person who says, I won't get vaccinated. It means sitting down with them and saying, why don't you want to get vaccinated? Tell me where you're coming from. Why do you feel that way? And giving them some space to open up and talk. And then maybe they'll be a little more open also to hearing you say, well, here's why I think getting vaccinated would be a good idea.
And I do think that also speaks to a question we just got from Rob Stevens, who points out, absolutely true, humbling but true, that few of the points or sources that we're talking about are going to get out into the broader public. But he says, so what can we do to reach those who are not reachable via this medium? To protect this civil society that, in Rob's words, we innocently assumed would continue.
Yes. Oh, nicely said, Rob. One of the things that we're working on right now in the core curriculum is thinking about a set of projects that will take the kind of conversations that we have in the core out into the public space. We're partnering with an initiative here at Columbia, which was launched by the Trust Collaboratory, called Listening Tables, where we set up tables on campus and we give students an opportunity to sit down and talk with one another about really contentious issues. We have a fellowship that we're running right now that's actually training students to host these tables and to get these conversations going. We're looking at the possibility of taking this model off campus as well and trying to engage people throughout New York City in some of these ideas. We have another program going right now, which is called Practices in Community Building, where we have 25 undergraduate students who are thinking about many of these ideas from the core and are developing some projects that they will be running on campus this semester with the aim of bringing people together and fostering community. It's my conviction that the fate of liberal democracy and the fate of the humanities are deeply intertwined. And that part of what we need to do in order to address the problems that we're seeing in both of them is to get some of the work that we do in the classroom out into the public space and to find ways to talk to people and engage them in these conversations and get them thinking about these ideas.
IRL, right, Larry? Get them engaged in conversation.
IRL, yes, exactly.
That's what everyone needs to have. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough for all of your leadership in the college and for engaging me in this conversation tonight. And thank you so much to everyone who joined. Larry, I have so much confidence in the future of the core with you at the helm. So thank you very much for that.
Jen, thank you. That means so much to me. And I always love talking with you. It's always a real pleasure. And thank you for being such a good friend to us in the core as well.
My pleasure. All right. I think, Tao, you're up.
Thank you so much, Jen and Larry, for this deeply insightful conversation. If I were to summarize my takeaways, I would say what we've discovered in this conversation is that there are no clear answers. The magic lies in the conversation. And that brings to mind actually something our most beloved alum, Alexander Hamilton, wrote in Federalist number 85. I never expect to see a perfect work from imperfect man. The result of the deliberations of all collective bodies must necessarily be a compound as well of the errors and prejudices, as well as of the good sense and wisdom of the individuals of whom they are composed. How can perfection spring from such materials? A big thank you to all the alumni, students, and friends in attendance. You submitted great questions, and we are glad we got to most of them. If you wish to stay or get involved with the college community, please reach out to us at ccalumni@columbia.edu. Again, that's ccalumni@columbia.edu. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us, and have a good night.